Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices. Our hostess for today's program is Teresa Miller, Executive Director for the Oklahoma Center for Poets and Writers at OSU Tulsa.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very special guest today is Pulitzer winner Edward P. Jones, author of The Known World. Thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you for inviting me.
Edward, this novel, The Known World, is a wonderfully rich, detailed, complex, layered book. The adjectives just come and come and come. Word has it that you did the actual literary writing of it in 1 year. Is that true?
Yeah, it was more or less a year. I mean, I started the physical act of writing it a few days after Christmas of 2001, and by March I had the first draft, and then I laid off and did some stories, and then I went back, and by about June, I was ready to send it to my agent. And then after that, after the woman who became my editor saw it, then there were several more revisions. So, yes, more or less a year and some months, I think.
Well, it's an overwhelming book. When you talk about doing revisions, this book seems so perfect to me. What sorts of changes did you have to make to it?
Well, let's see. You know, you're always trying to make the sentences as smooth and as beautiful as possible. So you go over them again and again as often as you feel you need to. You know, there are things that didn't catch your eye the first time. They catch your eye, or maybe on the fifth or sixth going over. I just had the German translator email me last week about something that he found, where I'm talking about a slave auction that was one day in the spring and one day in the fall, and he noted that I talked about the weather for one particular season, the slave auction going on for days. So, and I noticed after the hardcover had come out that at one point I had the sheriff on the same page within about 10 lines get into a carriage twice. So those are the things you try to catch during the revisions, and even, you know, you can go over it many, many times and still there are things that are loose.
Well, you've certainly succeeded in creating the beautiful, smooth sentences. This book has been compared to the work of Faulkner and even the Bible. That's got to be kind of an overwhelming feeling for you as the author.
Yeah, it is. I mean, particularly because I wrote it and I had hopes and everything. The greatest hope I had was that I would find a publisher. I never imagined all the things that came after that.
Well, and you had published a previous book, a collection of short stories, Lost in the City, that had gotten all kinds of critical acclaim, but nothing to match the sort of acclaim that you received for this. For us, this book starts with your character Moses. How did it begin for you personally? It's been a long time since I began since I thought of those first pages. I think, as far as I can remember, I believe the first images that came to me were of the central character, Henry Townsend, on his deathbed. He's in his bedroom dying, and there are 3 women in the room. And I think that was the first thing that came to me, but the decision was made down the line that I would not use that as the opening, but have instead Moses the overseer. Mm-hmm. So it's been so long, and I never took notes about what I was doing because I never thought that there would be this sort of interest. Well, maybe that adds to the credibility and forthrightness of the book, that you weren't writing it for publication necessarily, that you were writing it because you were highly motivated. When did you first learn about black slaveholders?
I was in college, and there was, I don't remember exactly what it was, and it wasn't a book and it wasn't a lecture by a professor. It was something as tiny as a footnote someplace, I think. It could have been in one sentence someplace, but it wasn't anything extensive, and it was quite a surprise, of course, but I just filed it away, and remember that years and years and years later, after I had finished the first book and was thinking about what I would do next.
And so, what kind of research did you do?
to find out about black slaveholders?
Well, I did no research whatsoever. I started after I had finished the first book in 91 or so, and I began thinking about this novel, and what I told myself is that because, of course, it was a different century, different era, the world was different, that I should read as much as I could. I had about 30 books or so on slavery, and I ended up buying about 10 more with the full intention of reading them all and then sitting down and writing the novel. I started one year, maybe 91, it may have been 91, 92, and I only got a few pages into it. I took a lot of notes on that. I think I may have read it maybe 50 pages. And I took quite a lot of notes. And I stopped reading the book, I think for a variety of reasons. Primarily, I think my heart wasn't in doing any research at that time. The next year, I went back, not to that book, but to one that came out during the Depression, The Negro in Virginia, about slavery in the Commonwealth. And I got about as far as with the first book, 30, 40 pages. I didn't take any notes with that one, but what happened is that I just stopped, and because I was realizing that I was having to read these books not for pure edification, as with all the other previous readings I had done up until then in my life, or for the pleasure of reading, but as some sort of project, you know. And so I stopped reading The Negro in Virginia, and I think I picked it up maybe a year or so later, and so I had to read the same pages again. And this went on actually for several years, where I could not get beyond the first 2 or so chapters. And eventually I stopped picking up the book. But over all those years, from the very beginning, though, I was crafting the book in my head. And after about 10 years or so of putting off all the research, I finally decided that I was never going to read all those books, and that I should just pull out what I had been creating in my head.
Were you intimidated at all by the epic sweep of this book? You follow 40-plus characters through one of the most tumultuous, conflicted times in American history.
No, I think what sort of the fear I had came not with that, but with this idea that I was writing something would probably be some 300 or so pages, because up to then I had only written stories. And with stories, of course, you're 25, 30 pages and you're finished. Here I knew that, you know, a chapter might be that long, but there had to be more and more and more before the story was complete. So that was my major concern. And I think I just went at it and thought that, because you have to have some sort of reward as you go along. With a story, of course, the reward is almost immediate, because you can have it crafted, the first version of it done. So I just thought in terms of chapters of being stories in a certain way, and so I would get some sort of feeling of reward after I completed a chapter. But as far as all the characters and everything, I think that I never took any notes, not one single note over all those years. And the only writing I ever did in all those 10 years was 12 pages. I think what happens is, and I didn't, you know, not just not do any writing, but I didn't sit around and contemplate what was going on. I lived my life. You know, I went to supermarkets, I waited for the bus, I waited for the subway. I just simply lived my life. And in the course of all of that, I was working a novel out in my head. And I think in that way, the people become, it's as if you're living in a village, you know, and you don't need to take notes about Mrs. Smith across the street or Mr. Johnson down the street, because they're part of your everyday life. And you can, if someone comes up to you and asks you about so-and-so, you can snap off fact after fact. And I think that's what those people became. I didn't really sit down and, if some people, of course, you sit down on day one and start writing a novel, and then 365 days later you're finished. Those people take a lot of notes, and because I was living with these people every day, I never took any notes.
How did you settle on the title, The Known World?
Well,
I had, initially it was going to be titled All Ontega's Children, and that was because I was going to be dealing exclusively, well, 95% of the time with the slaves that were owned by the central character Henry Townsend. But as time went on and the work began playing itself out in my head, there were other people who were going to be very minor who began to take on larger and larger roles, like the sheriff of this imaginary county. And so that title no longer fit, All Ontega's Children. And sometime in 97, 98, the Library of Congress bought a real map. Supposedly it was the first time the word America had ever been put on a map. And I tore the article, I remember tearing the article out, not knowing I would have some use for it. And then when I got to a certain chapter in the book, I decided that I would use this map. One of the few times in the book that something that's real is put in the book, because everything is imaginary otherwise. So I just, I added a lot more to the map and gave it, the real map doesn't have a legend. I put on it a legend, The Known World, and decided to use that as the title.
How real did this fictional county, Manchester, Virginia, become to you?
Well, the dimensions of it is still sort of shady in my mind, but the people, I think, had to become real, or otherwise you couldn't write them down and have people believe that they existed once upon a time.
You even created a census report for Manchester.
Yeah. Well, my intention had been that I would go to visit a friend of mine in Virginia and use this county as a setting for the novel. But in addition to not reading those books, I never got around to visiting him. So at the last moment there, when I decided to plunge into the writing, I had to come up with my own place. And I had gone to graduate school in Charlottesville, Virginia, and so I knew a bit about what the landscape looked like, and I just decided to use that area.
We noted at the top of the interview that the book begins with Moses, it ends with Moses. How do you see his role overall in the novel?
Well, I think in a certain sense, I think they're all rather tragic people to one degree or another. But with Moses, when you enter the novel, he's already at the latter stages of what's going to happen to him. And but if you go to a point in the novel where you see him when he's youngest, then you see a very different man from what you have in the beginning of the novel and also at the end of the novel, because the beginning and the end he's more or less the same person. But if you go to the point where he's the youngest, you see a very different man, a man who he cares for this woman, this slave woman that he's just recently come to know. He loves her and is full of anguish because there's a possibility that they will be separated. The man at the end is very different in that he's willing to throw away a family. And in between those 2 points, you learn what slavery does to a person. It does something horrible to every single person, whether you're a slave or a master. And Moses is just one more example of that.
You do a lot of foreshadowing in the book. At what point did you decide to let your readers know the fate of the characters early on?
Again, that's one of those questions that I didn't take any notes, so I don't remember when that started happening. I don't think I sat down with a plan. I think I always knew that I would tell a certain story in a certain way. It's not really chronological the way I present it. But I don't think the decision to sort of stop at times and talk about the fate of certain people, that I think came during the writing of the book. When I've been asked that before, and when I look back on the thinking of it, those 10 years, I can't see myself thinking of stopping and then saying, well, in 50 years this will happen to him. In 90 years this will happen to her. I think that may have come along in the course of writing it, the physical act of writing.
There's so many great characters in this novel, complex characters. We can't talk about all of them, but let's focus on a few. Henry Townsend, you've mentioned him, very interesting gentleman. How would you describe him?
Well, the bare facts of his life are that the book opens and he's 31 years old. He is the wealthiest black person in this imaginary county. He is dying. He will be leaving a widow, and she will inherit about 33 slaves and a good portion of land. He was born a slave, and his father, Augustus, purchased his own freedom, then worked to purchase that of Henry's mother, Mildred, and then the two of them worked to purchase Henry's freedom. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, in the years when Henry remained a slave, he became a sort of protege of the white man who owned all three of them, William Robbins. That man took quite a liking to Henry, and once Henry was about 15 or 16 years old, this man, William Robbins, discovered that Henry had a talent for making boots and shoes. And this was the beginning of Henry's wealth. He helped Henry to get customers for the work he was doing. And this went on, their relationship went on even after Henry became free, or was bought by his father and mother. So the core part of his years of growing up, the influence was not his father, his biological father, Augustus, who abhorred slavery, of course, but the man who had once owned all of them, William Robbins. So Henry grows up with this sense that slavery is not so bad, and that he himself wants to be wealthy, and the example he follows is not that of Augustus, but that of William Robbins. And he goes on to own, as I said, those 33 slaves.
And I wonder if you might briefly introduce us to Fern Elston, who's one of my favorite characters in the book.
Fern Elston is, she's a teacher. She teaches all the free children in Manchester County. She's a very spirited, determined, intelligent woman, and she doesn't suffer fools. But all of the free people in this place, free black people who own slaves, of all of them, I have to say that Fern Elston is probably the one who realizes deep down that there's something wrong about owning their own people, owning anyone. But they continue to do it. But I think she, and I sort of hint at this, that in later years she comes to realize that what they were doing was wrong.
And you mentioned they were free people. They are free people, but there's so many wonderful characters who are not free, who are slaves, who are referred to as property. Mm-hmm. Did you recoil from using that word, property?
No, I knew right away that in the beginning that when I started writing, that I was going to write in a sort of reportorial fashion, a sort of presenting the facts, because the situation itself is rather horrendous, and I didn't want to put another layer of heavy emotion on all of that. The public record probably at that time would have said something about human property, and I didn't flinch from using, that term. It was just a decision that I made to just go with whatever the language would have been at that time.
In the book, you also deal with natural devastations that we can't help, like the smallpox epidemic. I wonder then if, as you wrote, you got any better understanding into those devastations, like the institution of slavery that we bring upon ourselves.
No, I can't say that I did. I think that when I set out to do this, the only thoughts that I had in mind was to tell the very best story that I possibly could. I didn't have any issues. I didn't have any kind of agenda, I just felt myself a storyteller and that I should tell the best story that I could. So much of the smallpox things, the floods. I think all of that sort of comes from the fact that I was quite influenced by a course I took when I was in graduate school, the Bible's literature. It was the first time, you know, I thought I knew the Bible before then, but I had never sat down and read it from beginning to the end. I read about 85% of it for this course, you know, just as a piece of literature. And in reading all of that, I was really glad for one thing, because so many of the people in the book lived the Bible. The Bible is the center of their lives. And it was good to be able to point to certain stories and refer to that in the writing of the novel. But in reading the Bible, of course, you are struck by all the things in life that can occur, the natural things in life that can occur. And I wanted a sort of biblical way of writing the book, and that sort of played into it. And along with that came all of the natural destruction that happens to people.
Oh, very, very powerful themes. Even though you face the injustices, the natural tragedies very forthrightly in the book, there are some very affirming themes. The theme of extended family, I think, comes in beautifully. The transcendence of art. I wonder if you could tell us about Tessie's doll.
Yeah, Tessie is the oldest child of Celeste and Elias. Celeste is crippled, and Elias was bought by Henry Townsend, and in those first months of being Henry's slave, his only concern was becoming a free man, and he runs away once and then is punished for it, and discovers that really maybe running away is not an option, given that the way he's being watched. Over time, what happens, though, is that he falls in love with Celeste, who, as I said, is crippled, and therefore can't be a runaway. What Elias discovers is a different kind of freedom, that a kind of freedom in loving a person and then having a family with that person. And their first child, as I said, is Tessie. And in the first pages of the novel, Elias is sitting at night with with a lantern behind him, and he's carving a doll for Tessie. And I mentioned probably, I think, one of the first times I talk about Tessie, she's 6 years old. And in the very same paragraph, I talk about her and the doll, and the fact that in 90 years she's going to die. And what she will tell to her family members is that she wants the doll, and they find it in the attic. At one point, when she's 6 years old, someone talks about the doll that she's holding, and she says, "My daddy made it for me." 90 years later, you know, seconds before she dies, those are the same words she utters again.
Very powerful, beautiful symbol, and those occur throughout the novel. You got the Pulitzer for this. How did you find out you'd won the Pulitzer Prize?
I was living in Arlington, Virginia. I had been living in Arlington for 21 years, but for the last 4.5 of those years, new people had bought the building, and they had a succession of tenants above me who made a lot of noise. So I'd suffered 4.5 years, and I was at the end of it, and I was in the process that April of moving in about 2 or 3 weeks, and I put off the moving until the very end, and I caught a cold, and so couldn't do any more packing. And I don't usually like to take naps, but that day was a Monday. I tried to take a nap around 12 or so and couldn't, and then went down to my neighbor, a very good friend of mine, Lil, who's now about 85, was perhaps 83, 84 at that time. And I got some soup, and I came back and had the soup, and I went to bed. This was about 1:30 in the afternoon. And at 3 o'clock, almost on the dot, I think, because I couldn't sleep, so you know, I was sort of aware of what time it was. The phone rang. The answer machine was in the other room, and I could hear a man's voice, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. Then the phone rang a couple of minutes after that, and it was a woman's voice, and I could make out that it was a friend of mine at the Washington Post.
Marcia Davis. I couldn't, I knew it was her, but I couldn't understand what she was saying. Well, I wanted to get a nap. I was sick. So I got up and went into the other room where the phone was, and I took the phone off the hook. And I went back to bed. And, no, I'm sorry. The phone rang 3 more times, and no one left a message. Then I went in and took it off the hook and went back. Well, by 3:30, I knew I wasn't going to fall asleep. So at 3:30, I got up and decided to play the messages. The first one was from Associated Press guy in New York, telling me that I had won and that he would like me to call him back and talk. And it was indeed, the second one was from my friend Marcia, telling me that I had won, and she was rather overwhelmed by it all.
Had you had any hint this was going to happen?
No, the only thing was this was April, and in that December, my editor had asked me about some biographical information about me. The Pulitzer people wanted. But I knew enough about the world to know that every single publisher probably sends in everyone's book. And HarperCollins Armistead was going to do the same thing with mine. And the company probably sent in 25 other authors. And the other publishers sent in 25 other authors. So, I knew what they were dealing with was hundreds and hundreds of books, fiction. So I didn't think anything about it. The day they did call, Dawn did call me that morning about something. I can't remember what it was. She says, "Are you going to be around for the rest of the day?" I didn't tell her I was ill, but I told her, yeah. And I didn't think anything about the question at that time. Just one of those, I thought she had something else to ask me. So that was the only hint. That was the only thing I knew.
We just have a couple of seconds here. Was it hard to let this book go? These people were your village?
No, I think, well, when the course of writing it, I lost my day job after 19 years. So I was concerned about, not having a job and not having any money. So I felt, if I could find a publisher, that would be good. So it was easy in that regard.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Congratulations on the known world and the Pulitzer. And thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.
Jackie Cooper Volvo supports numerous community projects and is proud to be a sponsor of Writing Out Loud.